The United States has just spent a harrowing 24 hours calculating the brutal toll of Winter Storm Fern, a January behemoth that turned a massive stretch of the continent into a frozen wasteland. From the scorched sands of the Mexican border to the jagged edge of the Canadian frontier, a 2,000-kilometer scar of ice and snow has paralyzed the nation. How did a seasonal weather event transform so rapidly into a coast-to-coast emergency? Why were the systems meant to protect us pushed so violently past their breaking point? And what went wrong in the quiet, ordinary moments that turned daily survival into a matter of life and death? This was not just a blizzard, it was a systemic failure of infrastructure and safety, leaving nearly 500,000 people in the dark and dozens dead. To understand the true scale of this catastrophe and why the worst may still be coming, we must look closer at the mechanics of the chaos. Winter Storm Fern did not materialize out of thin air. It was a calculated atmospheric assault, the violent result of a massive Arctic air mass diving south with predatory speed. As this frigid core collided with the volatile, moisture-laden air currents flowing from the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, it effectively fused the center of the country into a single, connected hazard zone. Forecasters watched in real time as the storm's footprint exploded, stretching from the Four Corners region through the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the Great Lakes, before finally slamming into the Northeast. A staggering 2,000-kilometer front dominated the map. At the peak of this meteorological event, more than 230 million people, nearly 70% of the population, found themselves trapped under a suffocating blanket of winter storm, ice, or cold-related alerts. The scale was so vast that more than 20 governors were forced to declare states of emergency, activating the National Guard as waves of snow and ice arrived in relentless successions. In a belt stretching from Arkansas to New England, snowfall was measured in feet rather than inches, with many locations recording 30 to 60 centimeters of accumulation. In New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, the sheer volume of white-out conditions didn't just disrupt travel. It shattered daily snowfall records that had stood for generations. The terror of Fern was not uniform. It was a shapeshifter, adapting its lethality to the geography it invaded. In the South, the threat was not found in deep, powdery drifts, but in the deceptive weight of freezing rain. In Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, a thick shroud of ice accreted on every vertical surface, turning trees into glass and power lines into snapping wires. This crystalline weight brought down the power grid for hundreds of thousands, rendering roads slick, impassable, and deadly. Further north, the Midwest and the Great Lakes faced a different, more primal enemy: extreme, bone-shattering cold. In the frozen reaches of Minnesota, temperatures plummeted below 40°C. At these depths, wind chills built with a speed that turned even a few minutes of exposure into a medical emergency. Even as the storm center eventually drifted away and the snow began to taper, the Arctic air mass refused to retreat. It remained locked over the central and eastern United States, trapping 200 million people in a sub-freezing grip that set the stage for a rising tide of tragedy. Behind the sterile data of meteorological charts lies a collection of very personal, very quiet emergencies. The death toll, though still being tallied by agencies with differing methodologies, tells a consistent story of loss. AP News and local agencies have identified approximately 50 fatalities linked to the storm. Reuters has confirmed at least 38 deaths across 14 states as of January 27th, while ABC News reports no fewer than 42 lives lost by Sunday afternoon. These were not just statistics, they were individuals trying to navigate an extraordinary event in ordinary ways. In Fannin County, Texas, the horror was unthinkable as 3 young siblings perished after falling through the thin ice of a frozen pond. In Frisco, a moment of winter play ended in a nightmare when a 16-year-old girl, riding a sled towed behind a vehicle, struck a curb and a tree. Near Austin, the cold claimed a victim in the desolate parking lot of an abandoned gas station, where someone seeking shelter succumbed to hypothermia. In Arkansas, a 17-year-old on an ATV lost his life when his vehicle lost traction on the ice and collided with a tree. These deaths reflect the brutal reality that when the environment turns hostile, the margin for error disappears in seconds. As the cold deepened, the tragedy moved into the heart of the nation's largest cities. In New York City, authorities confirmed at least 8 deaths, many involving the elderly and the homeless population who were left exposed to the plummeting wind chills. In Pennsylvania's Lehigh County, the physical strain of the storm proved fatal as 3 people collapsed and died while attempting to shovel heavy, wet snow, their hearts failing under the extreme exertion. From Massachusetts to New Jersey, the reports continued to darken residents struck by snowplows or falling during the exhausting work of snow removal. Even the skies were not safe, as a private jet crashed near Bangor, Maine in treacherous weather, claiming 6 lives while investigators began the grim task of determining the storm's role in the wreckage. While the ice and wind raged outside, a more insidious threat began to permeate American homes. As the power grid failed, families desperate for warmth turned to dangerous alternatives. In Nashville, a children's hospital became a front line for a silent epidemic, treating dozens of young patients for carbon monoxide poisoning. Parents arrived at emergency rooms with headaches and dizziness, unaware that the generators, charcoal grills, or gas stoves they used to stay warm were filling their living rooms with an invisible, life-threatening gas. By the time first responders could perform welfare checks on neighboring apartments, the number of those requiring urgent care had multiplied, turning a lack of electricity into a widespread medical crisis. The infrastructure failure that triggered these events was staggering. At the height of Winter Storm Fern, over 1 million customers lost power as heavy ice turned trees into weights that snapped transmission lines. Even 24 hours after the peak, hundreds of thousands remained in the dark, with reports of 400,000 to 500,000 homes and businesses still waiting for the lights and the heat to return. For these families, the struggle was no longer about a storm passing. It was about surviving the sub-freezing temperatures in homes that had become literal iceboxes. The struggle for survival was mirrored by the total paralysis of the nation's transportation arteries. Airlines, facing one of the most catastrophic disruptions in aviation history, were forced to cancel more than 20,000 flights as the weekend drew to a close. Sunday alone saw a record-shattering 11,000 cancellations. American Airlines, a primary victim of the chaos, saw its schedule decimated, with 9,000 flights wiped out and a quarter of its Tuesday operations grounded before they could even begin. Major hubs from Dallas, Fort Worth to Charlotte, New York, and Atlanta became graveyards of grounded metal, with cancellation rates soaring above 40%. At Boston Logan, the situation reached an absolute standstill, with 71% of all departures canceled in a single day. On the ground, the situation was no less dire. Sections of the interstate highway system were surrendered to the ice, while Amtrak was forced to suspend or truncate vital routes across the Midwest and the Northeast as snow buried the tracks. Even as the skies finally cleared, the ripples of this systemic collapse continued to move through every facet of daily life, proving that the departure of the clouds did not mean the end of the emergency. With the peak of Winter Storm Fern behind them, the focus of dozens of states has shifted from immediate survival to a grueling assessment of the damage. Emergency managers are now navigating a daunting list of priorities, clearing frozen highways, restoring a fractured power grid, and conducting welfare checks on those most vulnerable to the lingering cold. National Guard units and state police remain on high alert, serving as the connective tissue for traffic control and the transport of critical medical supplies. Utility crews have become the unsung infantry of this recovery, moving neighborhood by neighborhood to cut away ice-laden branches and repair down transmission lines. The work is most severe in rural areas, where the grid was pushed far beyond its design limits. In the vacuum left by the government, local communities have stepped into the gap. Churches, schools, and community centers that served as warming shelters during the height of the blizzard remain open, housing families whose homes are still uninhabitable. Volunteers continue to brave icy sidewalks to deliver hot meals and blankets to the elderly and those with disabilities, ensuring that the most isolated are not forgotten. In major metropolitan centers like Nashville and New York, outreach teams remain on a war footing. They are moving through encampments and door to door in aging apartment buildings, pleading with residents to accept emergency heaters or move to temporary shelters. Large relief organizations are now coordinating the long-term aftermath, collecting donations, arranging temporary housing, and providing counseling for those whose lives were shattered by a few days of extreme weather. But even as they work, a new fear emerges. Engineers are already monitoring river valleys, knowing that when this massive accumulation of snow and ice eventually melts, the next disaster may be a flood. As the immediate emergency phase of Winter Storm Fern gives way to assessment, scientists and officials are left asking what this catastrophe reveals about the nation's long-term vulnerabilities. Forecasters at NOAA and the National Weather Service have described Fern as an unusually large and severe event, an Arctic monster that drove south to interact with moist air and create a hazard zone for more than 200 million people. With temperatures plunging below 40 degrees C in Minnesota and snowfall records shattered from Arkansas to New England, the storm tested every system we have built to withstand the elements. Researchers caution that while no single storm can be blamed entirely on climate change, a clear and dangerous pattern is emerging. A warming atmosphere holds more moisture, which translates into heavier precipitation and intense snow when the cold air moves in. Furthermore, the rapid swings between warm and cold conditions increase the risk of freezing rain and ice storms, the very events that brought down trees and power lines across the South. When these trends collide with aging infrastructure and power grids already under stress, they push our survival systems past their limits. There are also painful lessons in how people were harmed. The hypothermia deaths among the homeless and elderly, the fatal collapses while shoveling snow, and the dozens of carbon monoxide poisonings in homes without safe heating all point to systemic gaps. These tragedies expose failures in public awareness, housing security, and access to resilient, affordable energy. Emergency managers are now calling for a total overhaul, more robust warming centers, better communication on generator safety, and massive investments in grids that can survive both extreme heat and deep freezes. Winter Storm Fern has finally moved on, but its impact is still written across the country in dark neighborhoods, canceled trips, and grieving families. In just a few days, one storm reminded millions how quickly the routines of modern life can collapse when the weather turns extreme. Yet it also showed the power of quick action, how first responders, utility workers, and neighbors can keep people safe when the system fails. With another coastal storm potentially forming later in the week, Fern may not be the last test this season. The question that remains is whether we will turn these warnings into concrete change before the next historic storm arrives.